So kia ora koutou katoa, ngā mihi nui kia koutou katoa. Ko Alice Lidham toku ingoa. So hello and a very warm welcome to you all this morning here in New Zealand and this evening over in the States. I'm Alice Lidham, I'm Director of the Traumatic Brain Injury Network, and it's great to see so many people with an interest in this really important topic. So thank you everyone for joining us this morning. There has been a lot of interest in this webinar, and we've already had about 30 requests for the recording. So just to let you know, we are recording this session. A lot of people wanted to be here, but just couldn't make this time due to clinical commitments. So we will be making this available to people after this session. So it's my great pleasure to have Eve Valera with us today. Eve is an associate professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School, and she's also a research scientist at Massachusetts General Hospital. So Eve is going to talk with us about her work on the concussion crisis behind closed doors, examining the intersection of intimate partner violence and brain injury. And as we go through, if people want to, they can put questions in the chat. And so we can come to those at the end. I'm happy to raise those with Eve at the end if you'd rather I did that, or feel free to write your questions down as we go through, or we can, Eve, if you don't mind, it would be great if you could maybe answer some of those questions for us at the end of your presentation, if that sounds okay. Wonderful. Thank you. Over to you.
Okay, well, thanks so much for having me. And thanks so much for everyone for coming. I always appreciate it when people are interested in hearing about this topic. It's for, I think, a lot of people, a bit of a novel topic because people are typically very, or more, certainly more well-versed in understanding or being familiar with the idea of traumatic brain injury in athletes or traumatic brain injury in military folks. So my topic is not, it's you know, no brain injury topic is usually fun, right? I mean, because we're talking about, you know, a potentially permanent and, you know, terrible disability for some people. But my topic is a double whammy in a way because partner violence isn't pretty either. So I do warn people that, you know, some people may have experienced partner violence. The likelihood that, you know, if there's a handful of women in the room that at least somebody has is pretty high. So I just like to tell people to, you know, take care of yourselves. I'll warn you. I mean, I'm talking about partner violence. I'm not going to be like incredibly graphic or anything like that, but I do say things that will sound disturbing to, you know, people who don't know much about this, or if you have experienced it, it might be triggering. So I just like to, you know, say that up front, and, you know, don't be shy about, you know, leaving or taking care of yourself, whatever you need to do if you do feel something like that. And as Al said, I'll be happy to stay around afterwards to talk with anybody, etc. So with that, I will share my screen. So, we already heard, but I'm talking about, I sort of say the concussion plus is just sort of something I've started saying because I think as we go through this topic, I'll explain a little bit more about what that means. But in partner violence, there are more than just one type of things, brain injuries that may hurt a woman. And I say women, partner violence happens to men as well. And for the sake of time, I'm not going to go through a lot, but just to say that the data that I have are all on women, and most of the data that we have are on women. And so we do talk about that, but certainly men could be affected as well, although they're less likely to sustain injuries. Yeah. So intimate partner violence, or IPV, okay? Simply put, IPV is violence perpetrated by a current or former spouse, partner, significant other, boyfriend, or girlfriend. It does not have to be somebody you're living with, and it doesn't have to be some, you know, long established relationship or anything like that. Partner violence really just means basically violence that's committed against you by anybody you're having an intimate relationship with. IPV is a little bit more of a specific term than domestic violence. Domestic violence includes other things like child abuse and elder abuse. And so I just do like to make that distinction because, you know, brain injuries actually occur a lot in domestic violence more generally, but I do focus on intimate partner violence. Some really incredibly unfortunate facts about intimate partner violence. The first one is that it's the leading cause of homicide for women globally. So if you just think about that, if I were to tell you, I just heard on the radio that a woman was murdered, who do you think it is? Your best bet would be her partner or her ex-partner, but basically a partner that she's had a relationship with, which to me is a little bit crazy, but those are the odds. It's also IPV is also the most common form of violence against women. So think about this. I mean, the people who were supposed to, you're supposed to go home and feel safe, and these are your protectors, et cetera. We like to think that, as a family, as a group, if we love each other, we protect each other. Forget walking down the street. You're more likely as a woman to be injured, right, in your own home or by your own partner than some random person. So that's also something that I find incredibly disturbing. And it's found across all socioeconomic boundaries. It's not, I think people don't necessarily think of IPV that happens where they are. And it does. Okay. There are people who are disproportionately affected by intimate partner violence for sure. So, and those unfortunately happen to be the people who tend to be more disadvantaged, more marginalized groups. And so that's not good. But if you think that person is, she's some rich person, with a college degree, et cetera, that can't possibly happen to her, absolutely wrong. It doesn't matter who you are. And so I just basically like to talk about intimate partner violence as a global public health epidemic. And it truly is just that. And I have no idea, except for certain things like misogyny or just the lack of value for women more generally in most cultures. And there are some exceptions to that, but why this isn't considered a greater threat to humanity in general, because so many women are living and dealing with IPV. And so what are the numbers? They vary a little bit. Now, I looked for New Zealand, and this number seems to match up with the New Zealand numbers as well. And in the States, it depends on the numbers. Sometimes you might get 1 in 4, but 1 in 3 is a really good estimate for global estimates of women who have experienced physical or sexual partner violence. 1 in 3. So if we want to put that into perspective, I mean, if we think about 9 women that we may know, I think most of us would know at least 9 women. You could even take 3 or 6. But then I want you to imagine not which 1, not which 2, but which 3 women may have experienced physical or sexual partner violence at least some point in their lives. Because those are the odds. And partner violence, much like brain injury, is very stigmatizing. So people don't necessarily want to admit that that's happened to them. And even if they do want to talk about it, they often feel it may alienate them from other people, because other people may shirk away from it and be like, ooh, or, be critical, like, oh, well, that's stupid. Why would you stay with that person if they're going to hurt you? And that's a whole nother ball of wax. There's absolutely no stupidity there. So why am I I feel like I'm talking a lot about this 1 in 3 number. And the reason is because I want us to really understand that partner violence isn't just for other people. This is really for us and the people we know and love. It's happening to our daughters, to our sisters, our mothers, our colleagues, our partners, our friends, and we just may not know it. Because unless we ask, we're probably not going to find out. I mean, there are some people who are willing to share this information, but it's very stigmatizing. And a lot of people don't want to talk about it. Or they feel like they're going to lose friends, or if they're still in a relationship, maybe they're afraid to talk about it for fear of repercussions. So unfortunately, 80 to 90% of injuries to women are to the head or neck. I've had women tell me about being stomped in the head with work boots, punched in the head repeatedly with fists, hit in the head with hammers. This is, not just like a one-time thing, and whacked in the head with baseball bats. I'm not being sensationalistic. These are things that are not uncommon, and there are even worse things that have happened to women. Like, remember, one thing I said is women are often murdered by their partners. So if you happen to survive, if you think about this, those things could certainly cause a brain injury, right? But that's not what people usually think of when they think of intimate partner violence and the violence that's perpetrated against women in these situations. So one thing I just want to do right now, just to contextualize this just a tiny bit, is, I mean, I just want to give an example of somebody who came to me once she saw my work. And just so you can sort of see an example of somebody who's lived through partner violence. We'll just call her Lily. That's not her real name. But she was a woman in her mid-40s. No, she's a little bit older. But she was married to somebody who isolated her, did not let her leave the apartment, smashed her head against doors and walls for no reason, chased her with a shotgun, strangled her, which caused petechia, and made her lie about it because there was a paramedic, standing above her while she was on the gurney, and you said, "Did your husband do this to you?" And of course, what is she going to say? She's going to say no, because the husband was standing above her as well. He shoved her and kept her head underwater on several occasions, threw her off the porch onto hard, dry clay. She managed to escape. Won't give you all the details, but she did manage to escape in the middle of the night, etc. And so she was able to free herself with him, but it wasn't easy. Basically 2 to 3 times per month for 1.5 years, she would experience being quote unquote woozy from the abuse, from hits to the head, etc. And she woke up from being strangled 10 times. So she experienced a clear alteration in consciousness from strangulation. And in high school, she would say that she had a reading comprehension of a senior in college. She was very bright. And now she found herself, in her mid-40s, sounding out words because they weren't making sense to her. She had to, as she would put it, go to the dictionary for words she'd read 1,000,000 times. And she was quite frankly scared, and she was worried that she was already starting to dement. She had terrible word finding difficulties, forgetting names of people she knew well and had really light, long relationships with, and forgetting her train of thought when talking to others very regularly, to the point that it was, a real problem. I mean, I think all of us might do that sometimes. And she would report anxiety and panic attacks for quote unquote no apparent reason, because she was currently in a loving, happy marriage. So she didn't have to fear anybody anymore. So it wasn't like these were just the effects of being in, a very stressful, abusive relationship. Now she was happy. And then she basically saw an article, and she was saying, oh, with respect to what might happen after a brain injury, she's like, that's me, check, check, check. And she suddenly realized that, oh my gosh, this is probably what happened. Yeah, I had a lot of brain injuries from my partner. And now this may be what has come after that. Now, of course, we don't know for sure, but I'll tell you, she's not the only person, the only woman who I have talked to who had reported basically repetitive brain injuries, who had later really negative cognitive and psychological outcomes. So that's just an example. And so one of the things that we know about people who experience partner violence also report high rates of cognitive, physical, and emotional problems. And if you look at these are problems that women may commonly report, that we've known have reported for years and years. But if you look at these are obviously all problems that are commonly reported after a traumatic brain injury. And so if you put the two together, it seems to make a lot of sense. So once again, it's sort of like, why don't we know more about this? And we don't really know, but hopefully that is starting to change now. I know that we are making, I feel like gaining some ground in basically getting this on the brain, IPV on the brain injury map, so to speak, which I think is incredibly crucial, because obviously we're not going to have any interventions or help, et cetera, if people aren't recognized this as being a problem. So in terms of TBI, which I think most of you will understand, traumatic brain injury, I'll just say the definition that I used went back to 1993, where we defined TBI as an external force to the head and a disruption in brain function. And so just to state real quickly, because there's a couple different I guess there's probably potentially a new definition coming out in the next week or two, if there's at least a meeting about it. At any rate, a hit or jolt or external force to the head that results in any loss of consciousness. So even if it's for a second and you have a hit, jolt, or external force to the head, that's at least a mild brain injury. A hit, jolt, or external force to the head that results in any loss of memory for the events immediately before or after the incident, so post-traumatic amnesia, or any alteration of mental state at the time of the incident, feeling really dazed, disoriented, or confused. And also any focal neurological deficit that may or may not be transient, such as a visual disturbance. And so this was a definition that was very, it's used a lot at the time I collected my initial dissertation data, which is a few years ago. But nonetheless, I would say overall, a lot of these criteria are still pretty consistent. The last one, maybe not. It depends on who you talk to. But overall, if you have a loss of consciousness or amnesia or feeling really dazed or disoriented after a hit to the head, that should be considered at least a mild traumatic brain injury or a concussion. And so that's the definition I use when I asked women about sustaining brain injuries. And I didn't ask if they sustained a brain injury. I asked, after anything your partner did you ever have a loss of consciousness or memory loss, et cetera, asked in that manner. And what I found was that this was a sample of 99 women, most IPV affected women sustained IPV-related brain injury. So I'm going to present this to you in a manner that I have the numbers for the United States, because that's where I live. but just to give you an idea of what it's like here, these women here represent the 42 million women who over the age of 15 would have experienced physical or sexual partner violence in the United States alone, okay, by that 1 in 3 number. And what I found was that about 74% of the women in my sample reported at least one brain injury from partner violence. Now, if we were to extrapolate, which we know is not epidemiologically accurate at all, but just to give a number, that could translate into 31 million women in the United States with brain injuries from their partners. What was even worse was that 51% reported repetitive brain injuries from their partners. 51%. So that could be over 21 million women in the United States alone who have sustained repetitive brain injuries from their partners. Okay, sample of convenience. Maybe this is like, okay, well, it's probably not really representative of that 1 in 3. Maybe it's not. And I'll argue, and I'll be the first to say that maybe it's not, but let's cut that in half. Well, let's cut it in quarters. 5 million women sustaining repetitive brain injuries from their partners. That's still huge. So sort of like no matter how you look at it, I will be the first to say we don't have good epidemiological data and we do need it, but the numbers are high and definitely far higher than they should be and not getting the attention that you should, especially in comparison to what we think of when we see all the data and all the studies and all the work that's been done for the military and athletes. What I also found in the sample was that IPV-related brain injury associated with poor cognitive and psychological outcomes. Having more brain injuries was associated with poor performance on tests of memory, learning, and cognitive flexibility. And having more brain injuries was also associated with higher ratings of general distress, depression, worry, anxiety, and traumatic stress. So here we have basically a double whammy for women who are experiencing IPV and sustaining brain injuries from their partners. Because not only are they getting a hit in cognitive functioning, but then it's making it harder for them to have positive psychological outcomes. So you can imagine just being depressed might be bad enough in its own, but now you have potentially also these other things. So one of the concerns in doing this type of research is maybe I already said it wasn't the case for that one woman, but what if it's just accounted for abuse severity or for the cognitive variables? Maybe it's the psychopathology or substance abuse issues, because people often will say that, oh, this is a kind of a dirty sample, whatever that means. And we controlled for that. It was not the case that abuse severity was predicting the level people's performance on these tasks or ratings of depression, anxiety, et cetera. And so there was a link to the number of brain injuries that they actually had. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about brain connectivity for a minute. And why do I want to talk about brain activity? Well, first, we can actually measure brain activity really easily in the scanner. You just use the MRI and you put them in the scanner, just like you would get any type of structural imaging or whatever. And with brain activity, connectivity, we talk about both structural connectivity and functional connectivity. And structural connectivity just deals with parts of brain cells that connect different brain regions, whereas functional connectivity addresses regions of the brain that are working together but are not right next to each other. But there's ways that we can measure the activation in those different regions so that we can see, oh, region A is acting in concert with region B and with region C. And that might make up a network that, for example, is the salience network that is paying attention to things in the environment. And there may be another network that does something differently. And we can see those types of things by using different types of parameters and scans in MRI. And the reason I want to talk about structural and functional connectivity, and the reason I did the studies, is because we know that they're both critical for optimal brain function and ultimately for optimal behavior. And if we talk about what we've thought about traumatic brain injuries and what that involves, we know that traumatic brain injuries can injure brain cells that in such a way that it affects both structural and functional connectivity. And so this is just an example here of a neuron. We have the cell body, and then here's the axon. And the axon, as you can see, is pretty long and thin. And so when you have really traumatic forces to the brain, you can have traumatic shearing of that axon or breaking of that axon. And so the axon itself is small, and there's axons throughout the brain, all over the brain. And so if you have these forces, you can have these little tiny breakages or damage to these axons. And what we talk about might be, if you hear, when we first talked about trying to image brain injuries, we'd often hear the term diffuse axonal injury. And that's all it means, diffuse, because it happens in a lot of different places in the brain, axonal, because it often affects the axons, and injury, well, for obvious reasons. So basically, though, you'll have this neuron, a brain cell, that gets injured, potentially mainly right here, or if you have DAI or diffuse axonal injury. And so that the neuron can't communicate with other neurons. Maybe it can't, or maybe it can't communicate as effectively. So I decided to look at functional and structural connectivity in my first two imaging studies. And I'm just going to give you an example here of neural networks in the brain. And I don't want to get too, I don't have the time either, but I don't want to get, I'm not going to get too detailed or anything, but just to give you a really brief overview of sort of what I was looking at and what we as neuroscientists will think about, how neural networks work together for, to enhance cognition, et cetera. And so if we look over here, we have this is what you would see. We would call this the salience network. We have the anterior insula, and it's basically, we don't need to know, I'm not even going to talk about the names anymore because we don't really know that, but this is just one example of a network. You put someone in the scanner, and if you have them pay attention to something that you have to pay attention to something, then, in their field of view or something like that, we might see this network light up, right? We have to use certain analyses to get this, but nonetheless, we can see this. And then if you just have someone in the scanner, just kind of not doing anything, just kind of hanging out there. And there's other reasons that this network would light up as well. But we see these regions often light up, which is called the default mode network, or the DMN. And what we know is that it's important for these brain regions, for the salience network, for these brain regions to be able to communicate with one another, for this network to be effective. And likewise here, these brain regions. But what we also know is that it's important for these networks to also communicate with one another. And in one of the studies that was done by a really bright group led by David Sharp and worked with him and his colleagues, they actually looked at the right anterior insula and how it was connecting with regions in the default network in a group of individuals who had sustained brain injuries, not IPV, but just kind of other types of brain injuries. And they found that during a cognitively demanding task, the folks who hadn't sustained brain injuries had increases in connectivity between this region and regions in the default mode network. But you didn't see those same types of increases for the individuals who sustained a brain injury. So I said, can I see that in my women? Can we see whether or not there's a relationship between the degree of connectivity between these two networks and the number of brain injuries the women sustained? And lo and behold, I was able to. I found that brain injuries were associated with that network connectivity, but not only that, that network connectivity was associated with memory and learning. And so just as an overview of what I found, this is just a schematic of the brain. And again, I don't think the names of the regions really matter. For those of you who are familiar with this, you can see them here. But basically, the more recent and the greater number of brain injuries a woman had, the less positively the posterior cingulate precuneus region communicated with the right anterior insula. And the less positively those brain regions communicated with one another, the worse a woman tended to be able to learn a list of words and remember that list 20 minutes later. So there is a real functional significance of the ability of these two regions to communicate with one another, okay? And having more brain injuries was associated with that ability. So next we looked at structural connectivity, and I found, again, modeling it off of a study that was done in repetitively concussed American football players. And I found that IPV-related brain injuries were associated with structural connectivity in the posterior and superior coronal radiata. So we basically started out with these 3 a priori regions of interest, which were identified in this other paper on football players, where they showed decreased diffusion in the axons, decreased fractional anisotropy in basically in these regions. And so we said, can we see that same type of effect, or can we look at the number of brain injuries and relate that to the degree of fractional anisotropy overall in this region? And we were able to do that. And again, you don't need to necessarily, if you don't know neuroimaging, you wouldn't, all those details are probably more than you need to know. And that's the most technical I'm going to get here. But it just goes to show that what we're seeing in other groups, like folks who've sustained brain injuries in other areas, or in American football, if we look in women who have experienced partner violence, we can see similar things. So we need to keep looking, and we need to really understand what's going on with these women. So I'm going to talk about what I would call is the plus in the concussion plus part of the title of the talk. And that's the strangulation. And strangulation is a serious form of abuse. And the reason I mention it here is because it can cause an acquired brain injury. Strangulation is not choking. Choking is when we get something lodged inside our throats, okay? If a woman says, I was choked, that's fine. And even in our measures, we will use the conflict tactic scale, for example, says, have you ever been choked? And that's fine, right? Because that's what a lot of people, the general public, recognize, or they that's what they think it might be called. And so this isn't, so we can't use the word choking, but just to understand the seriousness of strangulation, it's not choking. It is an external attack on the neck, okay? In terms that you will often hear associated with strangulation are asphyxia and hypoxia and anoxia. And all those terms mean are just that there's variants of depriving the body of oxygen. If you deprive the body of oxygen enough, or cells, you might kill the cell. Or if it's more global, you might actually lead to unconsciousness or death. Hypoxia is simple partial loss of oxygen to tissue, and anoxia is complete absence of oxygen to the tissue. So when you hear these terms, that's all they really mean. And so when you talk about strangulation, it's basically a form of asphyxia from external pressure placed upon the neck. Okay? Now, when we talk about strangulation, it's not just, I think some people, and at least I certainly did, I thought of it initially was, oh, you block the windpipes, they can't breathe. No, it's external. It's basically external pressure placed upon the neck such that there's an obstruction of blood flow either from or to the brain via the jugular or the carotid, or an obstruction of the airway. And if it's of the blood flow, it's remarkably easy to put your hands or anything on somebody's neck and reduce or stop the blood flow, either from leaving the brain or entering the brain. And the jugular veins are a little more lateral than the carotids and a little bit easier to occlude. So if you just put pressure and occlude the jugular, then you stop blood from exiting the brain. And so if you just have blood going in, then you might have increased intracranial pressure. Okay, and so that could cause problems in its own right. But then if you block both of these, you don't have to worry about increased intracranial pressure anymore, but now you don't have that wonderful oxygen-rich blood going into the brain. And so that's going to be a problem because, well, you could have cell death or damage. So blood buildup or lack of enough oxygen from strangulation can cause damage quickly. Blood buildup can cause unconsciousness within 2 minutes. Anoxia can cause unconsciousness within 10 seconds. And strangulation can cause brain death in less than 4 minutes while leaving no external mark. I think people assume you have to see it for it to be severe, but that's not the case. And damage may result in death. Now, it's more likely to be pretty quickly, but in a couple of cases, it seems like it's happened weeks later from things like, for example, a carotid dissection, which may result in a stroke. So we do need to be really careful about the possible outcomes of strangulation. So signs of strangulation when visible often appear red or bruised. I'm not going to go through these quickly in the interest of time, but if you do see something with respect to strangulation, it's usually of the red type and like petechia or something like, or blood in the eyes or something like that. But like I said, you often won't see it, but what you might see more of are symptoms of strangulation, which may be observed, immediately or later, which would be coughing, voice changes, loss of voice, loss of consciousness, difficulty swallowing or breathing, raspy breathing, pain or tenderness on the neck. And then here we get to some things that may be resultant from alterations in consciousness, so mental status changes, combativeness or amnesia. Unfortunately, women will involuntarily urinate or defecate on themselves, and vision changes. So those are some of the things that if you're looking for this may happen. But if you're not looking for it, you may not recognize it. And also strangulation is one of the best predictors of later homicide. The odds of becoming a homicide victim increased by about 7-fold for women who had previously been strangled by their partner. Okay. And then this is just some data on a small study, which I'm not going to go into now. But for the purposes of what we're talking about here is in that concussion plus this acquired brain injury. Rates of strangulation vary, but it varies depending on how it's measured. And the numbers always high in my view, too high to be comfortable. If you just say, did your partner ever choke you, the conflict tactic scale item, 86% of women, at least in that 99 sample of 99, and this is a pretty consistent loss across a lot of samples that I've looked at, reported at least one incident. If you say after anything your partner ever did to you, did you ever lose consciousness, feel dizzy, feel dazed or disoriented, getting at that sense of an strangulation-related alteration in consciousness, 27% reported at least one alteration in consciousness from strangulation from their partner. And what I found also in a follow-up study that we just published earlier this year was that strangulation-related alterations in consciousness were associated with poor cognitive and psychological functions. Women who experienced this type of alteration in consciousness were more likely to have poor performance on tests of both long-term and working memory, so long and short-term memory, and higher ratings of depression and post-traumatic stress. And so we could say, well, is it just that the women who are strangled are also experiencing traumatic brain injuries? And so that may be a confound. And so we did actually look at the number of IPV-related brain injury, traumatic brain injuries, not just acquired brain injuries more generally, as a covariate, and the relationship still held. And child abuse is also very common in women who have experienced partner violence, and the relationship held there as well. So I'm just gonna, again, I'm gonna take, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but unfortunately, COVID has been, some might say like an abuser's like best friend, okay? And really, we have women who were originally trapped in dangerous and terrifying situations. And these are just some of the ways that women can be trapped in relationships. I did not make up this power and control wheel, but you can find all different variations of it on the web. But women are often trapped in relationships and they really can't get out for a whole host of reasons, or maybe they don't want to for a whole host of reasons as well. And then COVID comes along and now women are even more trapped because some of the ways that they may have been able to, get away from their partner or abuser briefly are now maybe taken away. And the stress, etc., goes up. So we have IPV and COVID representing what I would refer to, and many others have referred to as a clash of two pandemics, which we know increase the rates of partner violence. And we can guess that it also likely resulted in increased levels of brain injury, because basically we have this increase in partner violence, basically stemming from economic stress and uncertainty, loss of jobs, fear of contracting the virus, and then the COVID mitigation strategies. When people spend more time together in general, there's more partner violence. When people feel like there's no place to escape and you can't get help, if you're wanting to leave and you can't, you're going to end up experiencing more partner violence. And so we also saw that severity of partner violence went up over COVID. There's at least 1 or 2 papers that looked at that. And so if IPV severity is escalating, certainly would make sense that brain injuries are escalating, but we don't have the data to like, this isn't something that people were actively looking at. And we also saw that homicide rates in IPV went up in many places in the world post-COVID. So in short, we have a much bigger problem with intimate partner violence overall globally since COVID. And in some places it's like, oh, is COVID really that much of a problem? Well, it is still, certainly for some people. But even if we were to say, well, it's not necessarily, there's a lot, things are much more lax, et cetera, that may be true, but we still see heightened rates of domestic violence. And historically, that's consistent with what we've seen, because basically demands for certain services in terms of IPV are seen at an increased level for, even a year past the event or crisis historically. So we know that, we wouldn't expect that to be resolved by now. I'm not going to give this little example here because I'm going to be a little mindful of the time. If I have time, I'll go back to it later. But basically, this is an example of how a woman was, really kind of pretty brutally beaten by her husband in Uganda, and they could not basically drive a car to get her to a hospital because the president had decided that, intimate partner violence wasn't life-threatening. In his words, we're not dealing with all problems. Somebody is drunk and has beaten his wife. No, that's not a good reason to, basically stop the ban of the transport ban. And what happened to this woman? She was stabbed in the right eye and then she blacked out. And ultimately in the story, they talk about her recovery, et cetera, in her eye, but not once was there mention of a brain injury. And so this, if I had more time, I would say a little bit more. But the bottom line here is that people will see our intimate partner violence and they'll say, oh my gosh, look at her eye, it needs to be fixed. And they'll focus on that, the things that are so obvious, but the brain injury part will often get overlooked. So what can we do? Well, I say we want to start the conversation. And in terms specifically with respect to COVID, basically what I saw going on was that, as COVID went through different parts of the world, we could see intimate partner violence spiking, right? And people were recognizing that and people were writing articles about it. But what we weren't seeing was this recognition that we should be looking out more for brain injuries. And so that was one of the things that he said, it's great for doctors, et cetera, to recognize partner violence, but don't overlook the brain injury component of it. And I saw that happen here in a letter to the editor in a really prestigious journal. And so I actually spoke to the guy who wrote it, and he was like, yeah, it didn't really occur to me to go that far. And so it was great that he recognized the intimate partner violence and wrote a letter to the editor about that. But we have to go a step further in recognizing traumatic brain injuries and gendered violence more generally. And just to go back for that 1 second, one of the things, if there is a silver lining with respect to COVID and IPV, is it helps us potentially to open up that conversation, because we can say, I know that COVID has made relationships more stressful. I know that, people have felt less safe in their homes at times because of COVID. I just want to check in with you. Are you okay? Is everything okay? I know that, there's been a lot of stress in your home because so-and-so lost his job or you lost your job or whatever. And also that is very common. So I think that if we start seeing partner violence as something that's not something that we can't talk about, or something that like, oh, we don't want to like offend somebody by asking, I think we're going to make a lot more progress. And so one of the things I really want everyone to think of is, with respect to IPV, is I always want people to keep in mind the high likelihood that an IPV-related brain injury or strangulation may have occurred. Because certainly in my data and many other people's data, the rates are high. So there's no reason to just think that it's a silly thing to ask. And we want to say have the right questions been asked, because women will not necessarily recognize the importance of mentioning it, right? It's like when I speak to my women, they've typically gone to the emergency room or the doctor for a broken arm or because they had blood, from somewhere or something. But, a hit to the noggin where they were out for a few minutes or they had a bad headache or whatever. But, that's not necessarily going to get someone to the doctor. And that's not necessarily going to register as something that's important to report. And then, as probably most or all of you know, that a negative scan does not mean that there is no TBI. And in fact, if it's a mild TBI, for the most part, you will not have anything that looks, quote unquote, abnormal on a scan. And TBIs behind closed doors are likely to be misinterpreted or missed. I think this is really, really important. If you were to, and I'm just going to switch a perspective a little bit. So say this is a police officer or a paramedic or somebody responding to a domestic violence call, and they open the door and they see a woman who looks disoriented, confused, distractible, inconsistent. She may have a headache. She may even be a little uncooperative, and she seems a little dizzy or off balance. And then you look a little further and you see that maybe there's a couple of beer bottles or maybe drug paraphernalia. The automatic thought there is most likely going to be, and I'm not going to say we know this because we haven't even done research on this because we haven't been able to yet, right? We're still in our infancy in understanding this. But I think most people, and what I've heard consistent with this, is that it's going to be, oh, there's intoxication going on here. So unless you consider the idea that a brain injury has occurred, this woman may just look intoxicated. And if the partner's saying, yeah, it was all verbal, nothing really happened, she's just goofy, whatever, that will get recorded by the police officer and may later on in the judicial system be recorded there as well. Now, it could be that the reason she couldn't tell the police officer how she got into the bedroom from the bathroom is because she was knocked out in the bathroom, was dragged to the bedroom, and so she doesn't know because she sustained a brain injury from it. Or maybe she walked herself but has post-traumatic amnesia from it. So it's if we don't think about the possibilities that brain injuries have occurred in these situations, it's extremely potentially detrimental to the people who are involved. And brain injuries may make it harder for women to survive, escape, or keep her children. It may make it harder to assess danger and defend herself against further abuse, make and remember safety plans, go to school or hold a job so she remains more financially dependent on her partner, and it makes it harder to leave the abusive partner and live on her own, maybe making it more difficult to access necessary services and potentially adapt to living in a shelter. Shelters are not necessarily easy places to live if you've just sustained a brain injury, because you have to learn a new routine. There may be a lot of noise and bright lights, etc. They're still critical and we need them, but we need them to have a neuro rehab component and more awareness about the potential effects of brain injuries and the presence of brain injuries in women who may be needing to stay at the shelters. And for all these reasons, it may make it harder for women to retain custody of her children. But I always want to say this because, there's, a concern this information can be used against women. It does not mean that a woman is unfit. There may be other things that make a woman unfit. I'm not going to say, anything beyond that, but just by the mere fact of having a brain injury or repetitive brain injuries does not mean that somebody's unfit. If somebody's riding their bike down the road and gets a mild brain injury, a mild TBI, no one's going to say that person's unfit. So I think we do want to make sure we don't overstate what the problems are. It can certainly create challenges, but we don't want this to be used against women. And so basically what I say, to people who want to say, well, what can we do? I think most people here would understand that there's not a pill we can give women, but there are things that we can do differently, right? Interacting with women that in a way that's sensitive to the possibility that a brain injury had occurred. Simple guidelines that we could use that are applicable to anybody who sustained a brain injury. Minimize distractions, meet in quiet locations, have short meetings or take breaks, avoid loud noises and bright lights, repeat information, prioritize goals, make them smaller steps and write them out, talk slowly and to the point. So certainly more slowly than what I'm talking right now, and double check to make sure that she understood the information. So these are really important things to mention If you think you're working with someone who's experienced IPV related TBI, and you're trying to help them with things like a safety plan or anything like that, you need to recognize that you may need to work differently than you would in other circumstances. And it may not always be possible to avoid loud noises or bright lights, for example, but do the best that you can. And I could go on, but in the interest of time, I'll say we can talk more about that later. Just a few more. One, basically do one task at a time and stick to that task, be factual and concrete, allow extra time or help her to complete tasks, just basically say, oh, I'll help make a few phone calls. And these last three, I think, speak to, I think these are really important. Point out possible consequences of decisions she may need to make, provide respectful feedback on problem areas that affect her safety if she thinks she's functioning better than she is, and encourage self-determination and identify strengths. I can't tell you, I don't want to tell you because I don't want to seem sensationalistic, right? But what a lot of these women have been through is just so unbelievably horrific that it's amazing that they're, actually around talking to me. And the fact that they have survived means that they're strong people. They have strengths. So find strengths. Don't just say, oh, this is a broken down person, whatever. Figure out what their strengths are. And, if she's thinking, oh, well, blah, 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 I can do this. And you're like, oh my gosh, that's the worst idea. You can just say, oh, well, we could do that. But if you do that, this might happen. Let's see if there's another way we can do something that's going to have a more positive feedback. Or I'm sorry, a more positive outcome. So, and, who do I think needs to know this? Well, I always say raising awareness everywhere is critical. I've tried to put it in everywhere in my talks. I don't need to say too much about it right now, but judges, lawyers, police officers, paramedics, nurses, the women themselves. I think all of these people should know about this for different reasons, and IPV support staff. And then just to round it out with the women themselves. I don't think most women understand the potential impact having a brain injury, or more, I think more concerningly is the women who have repetitive brain injuries, either from repetitive TBIs or strangulation-related alterations in consciousness, and how that may be affecting their ability to function at the time. And when abusers are telling them that they're stupid and et cetera, they can't do this or that, well, then that may feed into all of that because they're, not functioning as well as they might because they're sustaining brain injuries. And so it may be interfering with their ability to function or hindering their ability to escape the abusive situation. And then we really don't know about the possible long-term effects. We really don't know yet. Anecdotally, it looks like women who have sustained repetitive brain injury from their partners have problems that you wouldn't expect at certain ages that I've seen these women. But again, we don't have the data. We don't have the researchers who are out there trying to understand this, but we need that. And so I'll just round this out with a little point of optimism. Every little bit of support helps. I'm not going to change this world. I'm doing everything I can to spread awareness and do research so we can understand it better. And those of you who are not even in this field may think, you can't do anything, but I think you can, even if it's talking to somebody or raising the topic. And then we can also look to our younger generation, create opportunities to inspire empathy and action in the next generation. And this Bees for Hope program is a program that was started by my niece when she was 13. She basically decided to make these bracelets for women. Anybody who's in the audience for any speech or lecture I give or whatever, or if I know of anyone who's lived experience who's survived IPV can have one of these bracelets, or if you know somebody, you can have them. I've given out, I think, over 500, and well, then COVID happened, so I couldn't for a while, but we've had this little note that's translated into French and Spanish, and women have just loved it. This tiny little gesture, and the note basically just says, hi, my name is Veronica, and I made this bracelet so you can remember that you are deserving of beauty, recognition, and hope. And then my son had an opportunity for a fundraiser in his school. He must have been, I don't know, 8 or maybe when he did this, because it was many years ago, and he's 11 now. But he basically was supposed to raise a few bucks for something, and he convinced his class that, pink concussions was good because he knows that, we have a task force for IPV-related brain injury. He ultimately raised over $300. He said, because women shouldn't have to be hurt. And that's him right there talking to the brain injury task force. No joke. This, which has got several countries represented, et cetera, with his background, et cetera, explaining what he did. So in the end, I just want to say IPV-related brain injuries are very common and dangerous. And I do think it's our job, our ethical responsibility to recognize and intervene. And there's my email for anybody who would like. So thank you very much.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. It's wonderful to hear what you're doing over there, and clearly shows how we need to be doing so much more. So thank you very, very much. Really appreciate your time. So I'll open the floor up to any questions. If anyone wants to come off mute and ask a question directly, please feel free to do so. I see there's a comment in the chat to send the link to the recording. So yes, we will certainly do that. So thank you very much. I will make sure Erica gets that.
Yeah. Eve, thank you. Your talk was inspiring and very educational. And I know, Doug King has actually just provided some data to Alice and myself to look at IPV, looking at the incidents in New Zealand from one of our hospitals. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see how that relates to your data as well, because I guess, as you've said, there's the sport and the military, but the IPV is very underrepresented in terms of the data. And we did try to submit a paper, I think it was 2 years ago, Alice, in terms of looking at how emergency department nurses might be able to assess IPV and strangulation in particular, and it wasn't accepted. It was interesting. So it would be really good to talk a bit more about how you can get the awareness of the issue, in particular in emergency departments, how you ask those questions, and what tools and guidelines there might be to roll out to emergency departments so that we help people first, but also are able to collect better data.
Yeah, no, agreed 100%. And, I think some of the issues are, I think people are afraid of the topic a little bit. They're like, oh, I open a can of worms. Now what do I do? And then I think it's just, certainly here in the United States, like the NFL players, they're so important. We have to devote tons. I'm not trying to say they're not. They should be taken care of, right? Everybody should be. But there's like a handful of NFL players and millions of dollars to study them versus millions of women and a handful of dollars to study them. So there's a super, super disjoint here as well. And you're seeing it there. So hopefully, I'm just hoping that as we talk about this more and get the numbers out there, and that's why I try to say, look, you found this in American football players and we can see this. So come on, let's keep doing this. So if there's anything I can do to help you with that paper, I'd be happy. I don't know if there is, but I thank you for doing that.
Wonderful. Thanks, Petria. Erica?
Hi, can you hear me? I didn't expect to be on video, so I apologise for my appearance. But I just wanted to really thank you for this presentation. Myself and a colleague are online. We both work in the Northern Territory of Australia, where we have, we're fortunate to work with a high percentage of Indigenous people, and I feel like I could cry because it just makes, I'm an occupational therapist by background, and it just the amount of women we see who have recurrent, I don't know why this is upsetting me so much, but recurrent traumatic brain injuries who never get the treatment that they need. And it just makes me think about how that really permeates throughout their life, their ability to parent, and to exist in the world that they exist in, and the amount of judgment that they get on the basis of, how they are actually able to live their lives. when, again, you know, when you think about the money that gets spent on sports people in Australia, it's come up again around football players and their poor, precious little heads. And, you know, I just really wanted to thank you. I think this is a really, like I said in my comment, it's a really galvanizing presentation that is really motivating to look at how we can do better for our women of all backgrounds. And for the babies that they raise. And I think that, you know, really respecting that it doesn't have to be, you know, something you can see on MRI to take it seriously and to make sure that you're supporting women to, you know, really get the help that they need. And yeah, thank you, Eve, for the work that you do, because it does provide the data that we need in order to get the traction and the attention, and it is really, really important. So yeah, thank you very much. It was a really unexpected presentation, but fantastic. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Erica. I appreciate that. And as I'm sure you're probably aware, and Indigenous women are some of the people who are definitely overrepresented in terms of experiencing more abuse. Unfortunately, regardless of where you are. So that's a population of folks who definitely need more attention, and I'm sure in this regard, I'm sure. I mean, here we have the missing and murdered Indigenous women, right? And it's just like, it's like if they're going missing all the time, what's the likelihood that they're not, others aren't sustaining repetitive brain injuries, right? It's just, yeah.
We've also got a question from Jonathan in the chat, who thanks you for the presentation, but wonders if anything similar has been done to explore the incidence of IPV TBI in the LGBTQI population.
Yeah, there has not been. So I have started an arm of my study where we are focusing specifically on transgender women. We know that partner violence tends to be higher in the LGBTQ plus community. So partner violence tends to be higher, right? And because there are some studies that have looked at that. And then we know that transgender folks tend to sustain more violence in general, in particular transgender women. And so they have a greater likelihood of sustaining more brain injuries anyway, but nobody has looked at IPV in this context. So we have an arm of the study with material specifically, and we have you know, a transgender man on our team who has worked with us closely to make everything as, you know, as sensitive and appropriate, you know, basically as it can be, right? With specific measures that may be particularly relevant to transgender women. And so we are looking at that now, and hopefully we'll have some data at some point, but there's not anything right now.
That's a good question and good one. And it's good to hear there's now work starting, Eve, and you'll have to let us know as those results come out so we can put them and share them in our newsletter. So good luck with those. Great to hear it's happening. Are there any other questions for Eve or comments? No. Well, I guess the only thing I'd just like to add is we are working with Eve and some of our team here in New Zealand. So one of the studies we're doing is interviewing both men and women who've experienced injuries to the head and neck as a result of intimate partner violence, but also domestic violence as well. So if you know of anyone who would be keen to share their story with us, you know, I think as Eve has highlighted really nicely, we need to learn and we need to hear from people's stories. That helps us move forward. So we'd really love to hear from you if you would be willing to share your story. And if you're keen, please either contact myself or contact Magdalena, who's also on the call. We will certainly give you more information about what would be involved. So thank you ever so much. Thanks again, Eve, for joining us. I really appreciate your time. And thank you everyone for coming along. It's a difficult area to talk about, but it's so good to have this conversation, and appreciate you leading that for us, Eve.
Yeah, I try, it's hard. I recognize that. And I try to, there's not a good way to you can't really sugarcoat it, right? And you also don't want to in a way, because that would be a disservice. So it's tough, but thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it. And I genuinely, from the bottom of my heart, appreciate you being here. And so I hope you'll have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.